The year is 61 AD and the province of Britannia is in turmoil. For the last few months, a massive rebellion comprising of various British tribes have risen up against the might of the Roman Empire. The southern cities of Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium lie as charred ruins and desolate shadows of their former glory. Lining their streets are thousands upon thousands of dead Roman citizens with their bodies bludgeoned, burned and brutalised in the most horrific of ways. Until now, the British tribes under the leadership of the Iceni Queen Boudicca have met almost no opposition to their rage-fueled vengeance for blood and death. However, the governor of Britain, General Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, whose cold and calculated plans to sacrifice Londinium in order to draw the Queen and her army to a more favourable location are now beginning to fall into place. Although the exact location of this great battle is unknown, the fabled clash of civilisations between the disorganised but vastly numerous British tribes and the fewer in number but highly disciplined and tactically superior military combatants of the Roman army is about to unfold. In today's video, we're going to explore the events following the massacres at Camulodunum and Londinium and the destined clash between Britannia's Roman army under General Paulinus and the indigenous British tribes of Queen Boudicca. This is the story of the Great Battle of Watling Street. To recap the events that led to the Iceni revolt of 60 to 61 AD, we must first revert back to the Roman invasion of Britain a few decades earlier in the year 43. The Romans, having conquered their way up the island of Great Britain from the River Medway to Hadrian's Wall, had for the most part met with little challenge from the occupied British tribes. However, one particular tribe located in the east of the province challenged this rule in a brutal and rage-fueled uprising following the death of their king, Prasutagus. King Prasutagus had negotiated a settlement that the Icenes were to remain largely autonomous from the Roman Empire but would accept Roman hegemony and supply soldiers and resources in a time of crisis if needed. This settlement was later abandoned following the king's death, whereby Romans stormed into Iceni territory to stamp their claim on the land and bring them to heel under the boot of Emperor Nero's reign. The response from the Iceni queen to this betrayal was devastating. Having risen from the ashes, seething with vengeance, Queen Boudicca united the people from her tribe and gathered as many allies from other British people groups as possible, before beginning the march towards the Roman settlement of Camulodunum. By the time of her arrival, the British numbers had swelled to over 100,000, and with little more than a small auxiliary force stationed at Camulodunum, the settlement was doomed to its fate. After entering the city walls, Boudicca's forces completely decimated the town, razing the entire settlement to its foundations and slaughtering the Roman civilians that lived there. The bulk of the Roman forces at the time of the massacre at Camulodunum were fighting a war against the Druids on the Isle of Mona off the northern coast of Wales. Upon hearing the news of the slaughter and uprising from the Britons, Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus hurriedly abandoned the campaign against the Druids and rode southwards. It's also worth mentioning that future governor Quintus Petilius Cerealis had attempted to relieve the city of Camulodunum by pitting the Roman legion 9th Hispania against the British forces. However, Boudicca's troops far outnumbered the Romans on this occasion and the rescue resulted in total disaster. Cerealis barely escaped with his life and the infantry of Hispania 9th were almost completely obliterated. With Boudicca now on the march towards Londinium, the Roman governor arrived ahead of time and initially planned to make a stand against the British, but later decided to abandon the defence of the capital and favoured drawing Boudicca out to a more advantageous location along the Roman way of Watling Street. The choice to leave Londinium and the surrounding area resulted in the British inflicting another major attack on a Roman settlement. Londinium and also the nearby town of Verulamium, or modern-day St Albans, were completely decimated, with any remaining inhabitants who had not joined Paulinus' army massacred in a similar manner to those at Camulodunum. Paulinus' situation by this point was dire, but not completely lost. Despite the decimation of the 9th Legion, the Roman governor still had the 12th and 14th Legions to draw numbers from, as well as thousands of auxiliary troops stationed across Britannia that could come to his aid within days. The exact location of the Battle of Watling Street is still disputed, as whilst Roman historian Tacitus gave plenty of description about the battlefield layout in terms of the deployment of British and Roman troops, as well as the location's topography, he gave no indication of its whereabouts nor what settlements were nearby. His description of the battle location was as follows. He chose a position approached by a narrow defile and secured in the rear by a wood, first satisfying himself that there was no trace of an enemy except in his front, and that the plain there was devoid of cover and allowed no suspicion of an ambuscade. Once British and Romans met at their designated battle location, Boudicca ordered her generals to be positioned in baggage carts directly behind the army, as well as many of the troops' families, who would join the tribesmen to witness what they believed would be the destruction of the Roman army in Britannia. As for Paulinus, his troops were organised so that legionaries were positioned in the centre of his battle line, with auxiliary infantry alongside them and their flanks protected by cavalry. As for the makeup of the battle, Tacitus again gives us a description of both the British and Roman formations in the lead up to the fighting. The legionaries were posted in serried ranks, the light armed troops on either side and the cavalry massed on the extreme wings. The British forces, on the other hand, disposed in bands of foot and horse, were moving jubilantly in every direction. They were in unprecedented numbers, and confidence ran so high that they brought even their wives to witness the victory and installed them in wagons, which they had stationed just over the extreme fringe of the plain. Moments before the battle began, both Boudicca and Paulinus gave rousing speeches to their troops, parts of which were recorded as follows. I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth, I am fighting as an ordinary person for whom my freedom is lost. Consider how many of you are fighting and why, then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will. Disregard the empty threats of the natives. In their ranks there are more women than fighting men. Just keep in close order, throw your javelins and then carry on. Use shields to push them over, swords to kill them. Comparing the two speeches by the Roman governor and the Iceni queen shows a stark contrast in how the tone of the battle and the campaign as a whole was viewed by both sides. Whilst Boudicca's words could be interpreted as driving at the emotions of her warriors for their land and liberty, Paulinus's were focused mainly on tactical insights and military precision to utterly annihilate what they saw as a subhuman class of lesser people. At the sound of war cries and blaring horns, the battle commenced, with a frenzied charge by the Iceni front lines towards the Roman formation. Paulinus ordered his men to hold their ground until the British came within range. He knew that the vastly outnumbering tribes would expect the Roman formations to break apart quickly upon impact and be overcome by brute force. He ordered 2 successful volleys of javelins and spears to devastate their front lines. The opening attack destroyed the first waves of the Icenes and brought the charge to a halt. Following this, Paulinus then commanded his troops forward in a wedge formation protected by cavalry on the flanks and a shield wall to charge into the collapsed British front lines. Unlike the events at Camnodonum, Londinium or Verulamium, the British tribes were no longer fighting unarmed Roman civilians or small numbers of auxiliary troops. They were now fighting the full force of the Roman army and were about to experience the lethal efficiency of Paulinus' troops. The British forces, having had their front lines broken in the opening moves of the battle, were now faced with the onslaught of a multifaceted Roman attack. With their densely packed shield wall allowing virtually no openings, Paulinus pressed forward and pushed the British back further and further, slaughtering almost all of the Iceni and Trinovantes that came into contact with Roman spears. The British lines were now a jumbled mess of terrified and broken warriors looking to flee the battle site. However, in a cruel twist of irony, the caravans that had been brought to the battle to watch what should have been the Roman army's destruction were now effectively blocking the British in the narrow gully between the wooded areas and the open road. While some warriors did manage to escape, the speed and ferocity of the Romans absolutely decimated any of the British who remained in the gully. Sadly, this also included their family members seated in the caravans by the Watling Street road. The Romans stopped at nothing to completely annihilate all of the tribesmen and their families present at the battle site. All in all, it's thought that somewhere around 80,000 of the British died at Watling Street, whereas the Romans lost only 400 men in total. Or, to show how much of a completely unbelievable one-sided victory this was, for every one Roman who was slain in battle, the British lost 200 of their own warriors. The heavily protected Romans, with their armour, shields, cavalry and densely packed lines with no openings to exploit, utterly dominated the loosely trained and underarmed and armoured British tribes. Once the panic had set in at the continuously forward-moving impenetrable Roman wall, Boudicca had lost control of all her troops, and the game was over before it had barely started. After the Battle of Watling Street, the Romans returned to the Iceni and Trinovanti lands in the east of Britannia and would go on to destroy and kill as many of the tribe members as they could find. The land was ravaged, plundered and laid to waste before being occupied once again under General Paulinus' rule. Before we wrap this video up, there is one question that has been left unanswered on what actually happened to Boudicca after the Battle of Watling Street. It isn't known for sure, as her body was not reportedly found at the battle location. According to Tacitus, she died shortly after the British defeat, taking her own life by way of poison, whereas another Roman historian, Cassius Dio, claimed it was simply an illness. Ultimately, it's likely that we'll never know the true story, but in whatever manner she did die, it would have no doubt been a much more favourable death than had Paulinus and the Romans eventually caught up to her. Although the Boudiccan revolt ultimately failed, Boudicca today is remembered as a warrior who stood up against the might of the Roman Empire and a fighter for the liberty and freedom of her people. It's likely that even if she had defeated General Paulinus at Watling Street, her end at the hands of the Romans would have eventually come. In the end, the inevitable victory of tactics, discipline and skill versus rage and emotion ultimately came to pass that day at the Watling Street battleground.